I'm with you always, even to the end of the age.
Well, you don't get to hear me preach this morning. Oh, well, that was better than hallelujah. I get the privilege of introducing our speaker for this morning, and in doing so, I'd like to give you a little history lesson, at least history from my side point. Bill mentioned during Bible class a little bit of his connection with my family, and he didn't really expound upon it the way that I see it, because he's the reason why I am here. Well, obviously he's the reason, but you're the reason that connected the dots to put me. Yes, you're absolutely right. So you go back in my long family line of we were faithful attendants of the Lutheran Church. We went on Christmas and Easter, and pretty much that was my whole family, from my grandpa to my grandma, start with my great grandma, all the way down, aunts, uncles, everyone. Well, as a result of that instance where Bill had done my great-grandmother's funeral and began studying with my parents, that of course led to them being obedient to the gospel, my whole and my immediate family, my brothers and sisters, all being obedient to the gospel. What he didn't elaborate on was that also went throughout my aunts and uncles, and a great majority of them were obedient to the gospel. So Bill truly means a lot to my family and to many others of the congregation in Council Bluffs that I attended for many years. But he came out to Bear Valley. My dad followed a year after, I believe it was. Oh, the same year. And then 2 years after that, I attended as well. So the rest is history, as you'd say. And him and Pam, again, have been, Pam's not here, and I'll let him elaborate on it if he chooses to. But so he's been an inspiration to so many, obviously, because he serves a higher calling, you would say. God has called him, and so you'll notice a lot of similarities, because I do view him as somewhat of a mentor, and you'll see that too. So Bill, come and preach to us.
Thank you, my son. That's what I feel like. And if it's okay, I'm going to stand down here. I don't like to get 3 foot above contradiction up there. I'd rather get down there where I can look you in the eye. Please don't throw songbooks. And Adam, what he says is true up to the point of I'm responsible. Well, I'm the vessel that carried the news. And just like you are, you're the vessel that carries the news to people. And you don't ever know where it falls, do you? When I went out to that farmhouse out in the country in Persia, Iowa, that's where they make the Persian rugs, you know. That's where his dad and granddad had been farming for generations, and met them that day. And like I said, I've set up the Bible study at his great-grandmother's funeral. And just went around the table, all the tables, as we had reception for them, meeting them, and met Ardell and Linda, who were here last Lord's Day. Asked them if they wanted a Bible study, and they, yeah. So I went out, and well, the rest of the story. And he didn't tell you, not even the ending of the story, I don't guess, but last October, I was able to take a campaign to Council Bluffs, where Adam was preaching. And the next generation was baptized Jacob at that gospel meeting. So if I get to baptize another generation, Jacob, you got to get married in a hurry here. I don't know if I can make another generation or not. But thank you for being here, and to thank you, I want to give you one of my books. This is the latest one that I've written. There's a couple more out there if you're interested. This one's called The Road Less Traveled is Sometimes the Most Beautiful. I took this picture on the place we live in southern Missouri when we're not here. And it's a couple thousand acres of woodland that my nephew owns, and he allows me and Pam to live there when we're in that area. And in the first 30 chapters are short lessons, 2 and 3 pages, devotionals. If you have a 5-minute devotional you want to give on a Wednesday night or Sunday night or something, there's some ideas to go through and get points. The last 30 chapters are, what do we say at the Lord's table? Darryl, you did a good job up here, brother. Appreciate that. And you may want some more ideas. Well, there's 30 of them in this book. And I got in the front of it, the Golden Church of Christ. So, Adam, if you'll put this in the library, and if you'd like to read or pick up something, and I call it a coffee table book, so you can lay it on your coffee table. Someone comes in to visit, and they say, "Ooh, what a pretty picture," and they'll pick it up and read a spiritual note to them. It only takes them 2 or 3 minutes to read one. So anyway, there it is. That's my plug. And there's some more material out on the table in the foyer if you want to look at that also. I asked Adam several months ago, I guess now, when we first started planning maybe me being here and making a presentation about the school, and I apologized in my presentation of the class that I hadn't been here before. I should have been here years ago, but for some reason we never did get lined up, and I knew very well. Rick Walker, of course, was here, and I know Adam, of course, even better, naturally. So I thought, okay, it's time for me to go to Golden. I've got to get over there and meet those brethren and talk to them about the school. And some of you have already told me, wow, had no idea Bear Valley was doing all that. Well, most people, we're just a little school over here, you know, on the edge of Denver. No, we're the school that is committed to reaching the world in evangelism. So I asked Adam, I said, what do you want me to preach on? He said, the Bible. I said, well, that's a good subject. No, he said, well, we're really concerned on evangelism right now. I said, I'd love to preach on evangelism. Because Adam's whole family is an evangelistic story. And I could stand here and tell you stories about the Dolan family that you probably wouldn't want to hear. But most of them are good. In fact, when I first went to their home, I called to see if we could have the Bible study after I'd set it up, and they said, well, we'll come into the city. That's what they called Council Bluffs, from out in Little Town. I said, no, you drink coffee? Well, yeah. I said, put the coffee pot on. I said, I'll be out in about 30 minutes. Okay. And so I went out. We sat at their kitchen table. Both Arlen and Linda were smokers. Arlen still looks at me and says, I don't see how you stood us. We sat there in that little room, both of them smoking cigarettes. Of course, they neither one smoke now, and wonder now why they ever did. But that was a habit that they had back then. And taught them the gospel, and when they obeyed it, they hit the ground running, and they hadn't slowed up yet. And so whenever I announced in Council Bluffs, I'd been 22 years. I was one of the elders at the congregation. I announced that I was leaving Council Bluffs after those 22 years, moving to Denver to teach in the school. Arlen was one of the first ones to come to me to give me a big hug, because we were buddies and still are. And I said, Arlen, why don't you just move to Denver with me? He said, I've thought about it. What? You're 52 years old. You've got 5 kids. You've got 13 adopted kids. You've got several teenage foster daughters. And you're thinking about moving to Denver in the middle of the crop year? Well, he did. Arlen Jr. took care of the crop the rest of that year, Adam's brother, and they moved to Denver and went through the school. And he is now, of course, preaching where Adam was preaching. I could go on and on and on about setting up a Bible study with a farmer. And where does that reach? Oh, you have no idea. The importance of a soul is invaluable. We can't put a value on one soul. If we reach one soul in our lifetime, okay, we have reproduced ourselves, so to speak, and we have become of great value. But you see, in the first century, people were a lot like us. I mean, people. They were a lot like the world is today. In fact, they were all gathered around many times listening to Jesus. Some of the scholars, some of the Pharisees, scribes, some of the Sadducees. Yeah, well, you've read the stories about them. They tried to destroy him every way he turned. They did everything in the world to kill him and finally succeeded with all of their planning. But we see in Luke chapter 14, if you open your Bibles to the book of Luke, I want us to look at a principle. From Luke chapter 14 and 15, we see a principle. Jesus starts out the principle in verse 25, and he says, and Luke writes it, in fact, he'd researched it all well, he said, Jesus was preaching to the multitudes, and he looked at them and says, if you want to be my mathetes. Now, I know your Bible doesn't say mathetes. It says disciple. If you want to be my disciple, but the word is mathetes. If you want to be my follower, if you want to be my learner, and I like the word apprentice better. If you want to be my apprentice, now what's an apprentice? Apprentice is someone, let's say that he wants to be a plumber. Who does he go to work for? Master plumber. He wants to be an electrician. Who does he go to work for to learn the trade? He goes to work for a master electrician. And he watches that plumber, that electrician, that carpenter, whatever he is. He watches him with both eyes and ears. He listens to what that guy says. He even starts thinking like that master plumber. He knows what wrench to use. He knows what pipe to cut. Because he's watched that man, he has watched him, and he watched him, and people sometimes mistaking, are you a master plumber? No, I'm just the apprentice. Oh, well, shouldn't we be the same? Are you Jesus? No, I'm just his apprentice. I'm trying to act and to live and to think just like him. And so when someone calls me a Jesus freak, thank you. Appreciate that. It shows, huh? Oh, he's one of those Christians. Oh, thank you. I'm glad it's showing. That's what I'm trying to get. And so that's what Jesus is saying in Luke chapter 14. If you want to be my apprentice, I got a requirement for you. You have to die. Now, I bet that shook him up. I've got to what? You've got to die. In fact, you ever watch the sitcom Rockford Files with James Garner? Oh, I used to watch that. I get so big, I get the biggest kick out. He'd get in all kind of trouble. Of course, I'll watch him back in the Maverick days. Yeah, few of you are old enough to watch him back then. But do you remember the squirrely guy that used to be on the Rockford Files a lot called Angel? Oh, he was always getting into trouble and come to Jimmy to get help. Well, the sitcom story starts out, here comes Angel banging on his trailer door, and running in. Jimmy, they're going to kill me, I need help. And he had gotten in trouble with the mob, of all people. And Jimmy said, man, I can't help you there. Oh, that's too big for me. And he went on and on and on. Finally, Angel just kept on and kept on and kept on. And Jim said, all right, I'll help you. But you've got to do everything I tell you to do. Anything, Jimmy? Whatever you say, I'll do it. He said, well, first of all, you got to die. Whoa, wait a minute. I've got to die. He said, okay, I'm not up. He said, I'm not saying I won't. Just give me a few minutes to get used to the idea. I heard that and that said come, and I thought, oh boy. That's exactly what Jesus was telling his disciples in Luke 14. That's exactly what whoever taught you was supposed to teach you, was supposed to teach me. Okay, you can become the disciple of Jesus, but I got one requirement for you, Tom. Got it right that time, didn't I? I called him Jim a while ago. And he said, no, there's a bunch of Toms. I said, well, I just call everybody Tom, and I'll maybe hit on most of them. Did that person teach you to die first? That in order to become a disciple of Jesus Christ, you got to turn everything over. Rulership of your life turns over to Jesus. How you think, how you act, how you walk. And that's the reason people mistake you as Jesus. Because you're just like him. Oh. That's the first requirement of that. And Jesus, of course, in Luke 14, following that example, he gave some examples of his own. He says, talk about a man that's building a house. And he doesn't have the wherewithal to finish it. He gets the foundation laid and he runs out of money. People will say that he's a fool. He started something, never finished it. Oh, what's he talking about? Becoming a Christian and not being faithful. And he said, let me give you another example. A king goes up with 10,000 troops against someone with 20. Won't he try to make peace first? Well, he considers the cost. He said, oh, make sure the back in Iowa was counting the cost. And you know, on some of the cases, whenever I got to that study and taught it, some of the people backed out. Some of the people decided, I don't think I want to do that. I got criticized by some of the brethren for teaching that class. I think it's a biblical class. I think it's exactly what Jesus is teaching in Luke 14. That if you don't consider the cost of being a Christian and turning your whole life over to Him, then forget it. It's useless. In fact, he goes on to say in verse 34 and 35 of Luke chapter 14, he says, you're like salt that has lost its flavor, lost its saltiness. He said, you can't put it on the land because nothing will grow. You can't even throw it on the junkyard, the dump, because it won't allow anything to deteriorate. It's worse than useless. That's what a Christian is that turns away from Christ. Worse than useless. Well, why is he saying all of that? Well, you remember that in the original manuscripts, there were no chapters or verses. Luke just wrote the story. And so we start out with chapter 15, which, okay, we got it down there so we can identify it. He says, now there were publicans and scribes that were gathered together to listen to him. But he says in the last part of verse 35 of chapter 14, he that has ears to hear, let him hear. Well, all of us got ears. Who had ears in verse 1 and verse 2? Verse 1, the publican scribes publicans and sinners had the ears because they came to hear what Jesus had to say. They wanted to know. Verse 2, oh, and there were Pharisees and scribes that were complaining. Who did not have ears? Pharisees and scribes. They didn't want to listen. Who was the ones that God was interested in, that Jesus was interested in? All of the publicans and the sinners came out to be with him, and the rest of them were judgmental. Oh, man. Then he starts in verse 3. He says, let me give you some examples. Now, I know normally we start in verse 11, don't we? Because in verse 11 is the story of we usually call it the prodigal son, but I kind of like to name it the loving father, because it has to more do with a loving father than it does the prodigal son. But anyway, that's what we call it. And it's a great story, isn't it? It's the longest story that he tells, the longest parable. But I'm interested in the first two because there's a reason he told those first two first. And what's that reason? Well, you see, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, the rulers of the synagogue and all that were against Jesus didn't value every soul alike. The Pharisee says, thou shalt love thy neighbor, if he is a Pharisee that lives next door to you. But a Samaritan? Oh, you remember the story of the Good Samaritan? Who's my neighbor? You know, the Jews, many of them, the Pharisees especially, before they would even say the words Pharisee, they'd say the word Samaritan, they'd spit. Ooh, they despised them. They're not even worth saving. They have no soul. And you've heard that before, some people. And so Jesus says, let me set things straight here. Let me give you two. And he said, 100 sheep. And he lost one. What does he do? He leaves the 99 in the wilderness. Not in the pen. He leaves them in the wilderness and goes and searches for that one lost one until he finds it. And when he finds it, he puts it on his shoulders, takes it back to his house, invites all of his friends over and says, look, the one that was lost is now found. And he says, and there will be rejoicing in heaven over the one that was lost, more than the 99 that were safe. What does he give that example for? The 99 are important? No, they're important. But the value of a lost soul was what he was talking about. How valuable, what extent will you go to reach a lost soul? He said, let me give you another example. A woman had 10 coins, 10 silver coins. Now, back in those days, a denarii or denarius, a Roman coin, or a Jewish coin, was about 1 day's work. You'd have to work all day long to get one. And she had 10 of them she'd saved up. And she lost one of them. Well, she had 9 more. What did she do? She swept the house. She looked and she searched. She brought in lights because the homes at that time didn't have electricity, you know. And she searched until she found it. And when she found it, she rejoiced and called in the family and says, look, that which was lost is now found. And Jesus says there will be rejoicing among the angels because the one that was found. Well, what do we see in these two examples? Let me give you 3 things that we see to reach the lost. Number 1, we see compassion. We see compassion. If we don't have compassion for the lost and a heart for the lost, we'll come sit in church pews every week. Man, I hadn't missed a Sunday in 10 years. That's great. How many souls have you led? Oh, well, I don't do that. Preacher does that. No. You see, the Great Commission is to each of us just as much as it is to Adam. In fact, sometimes I think maybe members sometimes set preachers over to the side and do greater evangelism than the preacher does. And so he says, compassion. We have to have compassion for those that are lost. Let me give you a story. My grandson is 16 now, tall as I am, big kid. When he was about 2, my 2 daughters, Marla and Misty, I have 3 daughters, but the 2 of them were shopping at some mall, and they had their children with them, and little Spencer, well, like I say, was 2 years old, and the girls were looking in some store into a counter at something, I don't know, jewelry, makeup, you girls know what you look at, but they were looking at this stuff in there, and the kids were right there with them, they thought. Well, after they had looked for about a minute, and my daughter Marla, and you have to know Marla to appreciate this story, she is over protective of her children. Spencer wasn't there. The 2-year-old had wandered off. Marla and Misty went into a frenzy. They started yelling his name, running up and down the halls, looking through every door, and crying and screaming because Spencer, 2-year-old, wasn't there. Why? Why were they so... Marla, she had a son, Seth. What's she so upset about in this one? Oh, you think that's funny, huh? You see, she would have done the same thing if Seth were lost. And they're both grown now, and if either one of them got out of place, she would still go off into orbit, and so would Granddad. No, the value of, what if he had 10? You had 10 kids, and one of them gets lost. Oh, well, I got 9 more to take care of. Big deal, right? No, you will leave the 9 at home by themselves, and you will scream and yell until you find that last one. That's what Jesus is saying. That's how much we need to search for the lost. Is have compassion for them, have it in our heart. People call it our pineal gland that's up here in our brain, tell me. Some people's pineal gland, that's where we have compassion. Compassion means to come along beside of, help lift and carry. That's a good definition I heard years ago. To come along beside of, help lift and carry. I see that you need something. You need some help. And I cannot be satisfied until I'm there helping you. I've got compassion. That word is mentioned 113 times in the Scriptures. And most of the times it says, and he felt compassion. Some translations say he was moved with compassion. Same thing. You feel it. It's, the Bible says, in your bowels. Ooh. In other words, you feel something so strongly that you can't be satisfied unless you're taking care of that. But what are we taking care of in the text? Lost. Those that are lost. He gives another example. He gives the example, of course, as you know, of the lost coin. And we said the lost coin is the day's wage of the day. And he wants them to know that the woman or the man lost the sheep will search until he finds it. So we have to have compassion, a deep compassion for the lost. Some people have a greater compassion for the lost than others. I can't explain it, but what I want to have is the greatest compassion of anybody. Amen, church? We want to have the greatest compassion that I can't sit here and watch TV because there's lost people. Some of my family and my friends are lost, and I'm sitting here relaxing. But number 2, not only do we need compassion, but we need effort. Effort. We got to the effort, not only as a congregation at Golden. What's your number 1 emphasis? Evangelism. Duh. Doesn't take a genius to figure that out. Why are we here? Why did you live through the baptism? You can't get any better, could you? Then when you came up out of the water, all your sins were washed away. You hadn't had time to commit any more. And man, why didn't the Lord just bring you up out of the water, and take you right on to heaven? He left you here for one reason, and one reason only, to reach the lost. Luke 19:10 says what? For he came to seek and to save that which was lost. That was Jesus' purpose in coming to this world. So what should be my purpose? If I am his apprentice, I'm acting, thinking, doing everything just like him, then why did I breathe after I was baptized? Why is my life still in my body? It's to reach out to someone else. is to reach one more lost soul. And the value of that one sheep and that one coin is so valuable, Jesus gives us a story about them. But the Pharisees and the scribes were thinking, those pitiful poor people aren't worth saving. And Jesus says you put a value on reaching a sheep and reaching and finding a coin than you do in reaching the lost. Because then he goes into the story of we call it prodigal son, the loving father. And how was the father left? Oh, well, I got another son. He's older, he's taking care of business. This little renegade kid I've got here, let him go, right? Not hardly. You can see the loving father standing at the door of his house or edge of his farm or wherever, looking every day. How gone? I don't know, enough to waste his inheritance. So obviously some time had passed. And whenever he saw that boy in the distance, he could probably smell him before he could see him, because he'd been working with the hogs, which was despicable anyway for the Jew. And the father said, here he comes back. Oh, man. No. The text says he ran. There's a book called Will God Run? Yeah. God will run. All we got to do is take a step in his direction. And he runs to us, falls on the boy's neck, hugs him and kisses him. And the son had his speech all written out, right? It talks about it earlier. I know when I go back, I'll tell my father, I'm not worthy to be your son. Would you make me one of your hired help? I've sinned against you and I've sinned against God. But he got into his speech and his father interrupted him. His father stopped him and turns to the servants and says, run, go back and get a robe. Get my best robe, the one I just bought and put in the closet. You go get that one and put it on him. You bring a ring, a signet ring that he can purchase anything he wants to in my name. Put that signet on his finger and put some shoes on that boy's feet, because slaves were the only ones that went barefooted. The noted people wore shoes. You put shoes on his feet and you go to the yard and you kill the fatted calf. That's for an important guest. Because my son that was lost is now found. But when the older son came in and heard the music and saw the dancing, called one of the servants aside and says, what's going on? Your brother that was lost has come home. He went to his father and he says, what has your son done? Not my brother, he's your son. And of course the father says, no, your brother was lost and is now found. Who was the elder brother in Jesus' example? Go back to verse 2 and you can find them. The Pharisees and the scribes, the ones that look down on the less valuable. And Jesus says, no, there are no people less valuable. Every person's soul is equally valuable to God. Number 3, not only should we have compassion, not only should we show effort, but we got to be persistent. Persistent. What does that mean? You never give up. What was that Winston Churchill said whenever he spoke somewhere in Missouri, I think it was, some years ago. He was the commencement speaker at some big university, and said he got up when he was introduced, looked at, the old Winnie they called him, Winston Churchill, and he looked out at the crowd and says, never. Never give up. And he sat down. That was his speech. And people have quoted that speech. Man, I can remember every word of it. Wow! But sometimes it's the least amount we say makes the most and the biggest impression. Be persistent. I have known girls that were members of the Lord's body, not their husbands. In fact, we had one couple, you got a couple right here that I talked to earlier. We had a girl back in Iowa. She came, Deb Ogle. You remember Deb? Deb came to church for years, had 3 little boys, stair steps. Not really. Was a mechanic, worked for the railroad. He never darkened the door. Deb never missed. She was there every time the doors were open. Years later, finally a study was set up with Rick. Rick obeyed the gospel. He has been an evangelistic tool for that church ever since. Because Deb never gave up. Be persistent. If your mate is not a member of the Lord's church, love them anyway. Be the example in front of them that they can see Jesus. In fact, they mistaken you as Jesus a lot of times because you act so much like Him. And sooner or later, possibly, 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, talks about wives be in submission to your husband, because sometimes, even if they're not converted by the Word, they will be converted or may be converted by the behavior of the wife. Yeah, and I've seen that many times. Be persistent. In fact, it's told me years ago that it takes 20 invitations to get someone to attend an assembly. 20! And you think sometimes when you first invite somebody and they come, man, am I good? No, who made the other 19 invitations before you got there? Oh, maybe it was somebody else. Be open, be persistent, be compassionate, put forth the effort, and never, never, never give up on a soul. That's what evangelism means. And Jesus says, don't say that the poor man is not important. Don't say that the maid at the hospital that cleans everyone else is not valuable to God. Oh yes. We're going to reach out to every person, because every person's soul is valuable. One story now closed. I don't know what time I'm supposed to quit, but probably are you supposed to, huh? Well, nobody's asleep, and you're not turning around looking at the clock yet, so... Richard Rogers taught at the Sunset School of Preaching for years. He died some years ago. He was preaching a sermon in Council Bluffs back years ago, and he gave an illustration. He said, I was preaching in this small congregation out in the country, a little white building. Everybody invited everybody to come to the meeting, and he said, I got up and I started preaching. He said, man, the place was packed. He said, there was no sitting room anywhere. And the back door opened as I was preaching, and this man came walking in, had long hair and a long beard, shabby clothing, and he came walking down the aisles from that direction and looking for a seat. And there wasn't one. Even the front seats were full. And when he got there, he walked all the way over and sat down on the stage, Richard said, right by where I was preaching. And it was kind of hard to keep your attention on your lesson. And this guy sitting there that looked a little strange. And he said, about that time, a few seats back, the elders got up. And you thought, oh no. What's going to happen now? He said that elder walked all the way down the aisle, walked over here beside this man, sat down beside him, opened his text to where he was preaching from and held it so that guy could see it. He said, probably no one in that congregation remembers a word I said in that sermon, but they'll never forget that example. Said that man became a Christian, cleaned up, got a job, and as far as he knew at that time, which was years ago now, was still a member of that congregation. The man had compassion on him. He put forth an effort. And he was persistent. He followed up after that lesson and set up a Bible study and taught and converted that guy. It's all because of the value of a soul, dear brethren. That's your lesson. If you have a need, if you're not a member of the Lord's church, you're valuable. Your soul maybe is more valuable to us, and I know it is to Jesus, than it is to you. We're going to give you a time to respond. Talk to someone standing beside you. If you don't want to come down here and talk to me or Adam or one of the elders here, we'll do what we can. Everything we can to help you. Or if you're a member here and say, I want to have that compassion, I want to have that drive for lost souls. I don't have as much as I want. So we'll pray for that. I ask you to put me on top of the prayer list. I want you to pray for me that I'll be more conscious than I am now of lost souls. And if you feel the same, would you come as Brian leads us? Would you stand, please?